为了确保会议顺利进行，同时为了保证您的收听效果，请将手机关机或者是调整成静音状态。Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to start a panel discussion. To ensure the meeting runs smoothly, please turn off your mobile phones or set them on silent mode. Thank you very much for your cooperation. 尊敬的各位领导、女士们、先生们，大家下午好！欢迎来到百年大党国际学术研讨会的下午场，也就是圆桌论坛部分。Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again. This is the panel discussion of international symbolism on the Communist Party of China's history of 100 years. 在上午的讨论中，我们可以说是聆听了许多知名学者和专家的意见。我们对中国共产党和中国的近代史以及中国的现状有了更加深刻的了解。那么在下午的 panel discussion 圆桌论坛环节，我们将听到来自更多领域的专家和学者对于当代中国的解读和对于共产党在过去100年所取得的成就所做出的一些见解。And in today's afternoon's panel discussion, we will have political leaders, experts, and scholars, as well as entrepreneurs from various countries and regions. They're going to give us some in-depth exchange of ideas and discussions on the topics of development of China and what they think of the Communist Party. 那么受到疫情的影响呢，今年我们的论坛是不能请到所有的嘉宾来到现场，将通过视讯的方式参与我们的交流。我们现在先有请5位在现场做主旨发言的嘉宾在台上就座，他们分别是澳大利亚墨尔本蒙纳士大学前教授、香港大学法学院客座教授高礼文。And due to the COVID pandemic, we are not able to have all the guests to be presented here today. Some of them will speak to us through videos, but 5 of them will be seated here and give us a live speech. And first of all, let's invite Mr. Richard Cullen, former professor of Monash University, Melbourne, and visiting professor of Faculty of Law, the University of Hong Kong. Welcome, Mr. Cullen. I believe this is your seat. Thank you. 还有全球未来研究所创始人及 CEO 程子俊先生。Mr. Chandran Nair, excuse me for my pronunciation, founder and CEO of Global Institute for Tomorrow. Please take a seat. This one. 香港兰桂坊集团主席、民主思路荣誉顾问盛智文先生。Mr. Alan Zeman, Chairman of Lan Kwai Fang Group in Hong Kong. Welcome. I think in the middle. Thank you. 还有香港大学政治与公共行政学系副教授、中国制度研究中心总监、全国港澳研究会理事严小俊先生。Mr. 严小俊, Associate Professor of Department of Politics and Public Administration of the University of Hong Kong and Director of Research Hub on Institutions of China, the University of Hong Kong. Also, he's the council member of Chinese Association of Hong Kong and Macau Studies of China. 我们还有一位是香港岭南大学高级研究员刘淑勇先生。Mr. 刘淑勇, Senior Research Fellow of 岭南 University, Hong Kong. Please take a seat. Welcome. Excuse me, my mask. OK. 下面我们就快速的进入我们今天的圆桌论坛的环节。Now we're going to go straight forward to the panel discussion session. First of all, please let me introduce Mr. Richard Cullen, former professor of Monash University, Melbourne, Australia, and the visiting professor of Faculty of Law, the University of Hong Kong, to give a speech. 有请澳大利亚墨尔本蒙纳什大学前教授、香港大学法学院客座教授高礼文先生发言。Please.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. Distinguished guests and friends, I'd first like to express my thanks for the invitation to speak at this forum meeting marking 100 years since the founding of the Communist Party of China. I'd also like to take this opportunity to express my deep gratitude to both Hong Kong and to China for the exceptional opportunities they've each offered me since I first came to work here almost 30 years ago. In this short presentation, I've called it Governance That Works. And my aim is to provide a brief overview of the journey to where modern China finds itself in 2021, the role of the CPC government in shaping that outcome, and the crucial importance of, to me, two aspects of that mode of governance: detailed, intelligent planning and distinctive, rational problem solving, with a brief reflection at the end on how important these aspects are for us here in Hong Kong. Let's just look back briefly over the last 100 years. In 1921, the population in China was about 450 million. The population of the USA was about 110 million at the same time, so about 25% of the size. The GDP of the US 100 years ago, according to one OECD study, was over 600 billion US dollars using adjusted figures. The GDP of China at that time was about 250 billion US dollars. Per capita income of the US then was about 10 times what it was in China. Today, the population of China is still around 4 times larger than that of the US, and based on purchasing power parity figures, however, Nomura Holdings estimates that China's total GDP overtook that of America in 2017. According to the Centre for Economics and Business Research in the UK, China's economy is set to exceed the size of the US economy using straight GDP figures in 2028. These remarkable improvements in China's economic standing are even more striking when we consider a shorter time span. Let me explain a little bit why this is so. After the First World War and the Second World War, the US grew at a prodigious rate. Amongst all of the major belligerents in both cases, its home economy was left comparatively unscathed. China, meanwhile, endured over several decades both a terrible war in China arising from unprecedented Japanese aggression and a massively destructive civil war. After 1949, recovery remained slow. The Korean War began, and the possibility of the civil war recommencing was real. China internally grappled with major tensions over primary economic and political policies. 2 extended periods of damaging turmoil were endured during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Just over 40 years ago, however, with the commencement of the open door policy, as it's called, China reset its economic policies firmly and clearly. Let's now consider the position as it was around about 1980. World Bank and IMF figures confirm that in plain GDP terms, the US economy was by 1980 almost 14 times larger than that of China, based again, of course, on a population only 25% of that of China's population. So what we can see is that in less than 40 years, China's total economy overtook the US economy in 2017 using the PPP measure, and it may overtake the US economy based on raw GDP figures within 50 years, that is by 2028. These outstanding achievements are unprecedented in world history, most of all because as they've unfolded, China has lifted over 800 million people out of abject poverty. The editors of a recent 700-page study of post-1978 China post-1978 published by the Australian National University in 2018, put it this way, and I quote, "China's reform and opening up is in the process of delivering to 1.4 billion Chinese people the fruits of the most consequential socio-economic change and institutional innovation in human history." The same study observed that between 1978 and 2018, the total GDP in China rose around 45-fold. The Economist and other publications have noted how the PRC has expanded its middle class at a remarkable rate, and the World Bank figures show how China has been responsible for at least 70% of the total world poverty reduction over the last several decades. According to a 2013 assessment arising from the US-based Pew Survey of Global Attitudes, 85% of Chinese people were very satisfied with the country's direction, compared at that time with 35% of US citizens. More recently, a long-term comprehensive PRC study was published by the Ash Center, based at Harvard University, and a 2020 survey was also published by the China Data Lab at the University of California, San Diego. Both of these assessments confirm that the high levels of confidence indicated in the Pew survey have been maintained. Given the steadily rising standards of so many and the extraordinary reduction in abject poverty levels, it's not surprising that China is a state which enjoys comparatively high continuing levels of general, unassuming confidence and optimism. China has managed to rebuild itself fundamentally based on its most abundant resource, its own population. It has traded and educated itself to be where it is placed in the world today. China has taken best advantage of the Western developed world trading system, that is true, but every other large impoverished nation has had the same basic opportunities, in a number of cases blessed with natural resources China can scarcely dream of. Only China has managed this astonishing feat of real growth and to the benefit of hundreds of millions of Chinese people. As China's opening has gathered pace, the PRC has encountered a huge range of problems, including severe challenges related to housing, education, medical services, environmental damage, governance, transparency, corruption, the legal system, public finance, and very high debt levels. For example, extraordinary progress has been made in addressing such problems, but both old and new challenges in these areas persist within an economically transformed China, and today they are accompanied by rising public expectations and deep concerns about a large ageing population. All these achievements are the product of immense hard work encompassing all of China's huge population. However, they've required fundamentally effective methods of political, economic and social organisation on a scale never before seen in world history, as the ANU survey notes. A book published in 2018, Regions in an Area of Globalisation, looking at China, shows how using a robust regional case study analysis, how complex development plans are forged, applied, evaluated, adapted and applied again in China. Not a few Western commentators assume that successive 5-year plans and other such policy documents are largely ceremonial. This book, however, shows the many ways in which they have shaped long-term positive developments. Plans such as these are not perfect, of course, but overall they work and work very well. The studies in the book confirm the central importance of continuous, highly informed detailed planning, accompanied with continuous, rational problem solving. It's very easy, as I just noted, to dismiss this sort of planning, and this is commonly done indeed in the West. But in fact, we can see today an unfavourable consequence of the absence of such planning, a rather remarkable one. The new US President, Joe Biden, has proposed spending over US $4 trillion on rebuilding the American dream. This is on top of combined spending since 2020 of around another $4 trillion US dollars to help the US cope with its own manifest mishandling of the COVID pandemic over many, many months. In total, this is more than 1/3 of annual GDP in the US in extra spending. So far, it's all of it significantly unfunded. Even more striking is the remarkable absence of any long-term comprehensive planning designed to ensure effective coordinated spending of these huge sums. It seems that the overall plan, such as it is A, to identify certain pivotal problems, relying regularly on comparisons with China to indicate lagging US performance, and B, to shovel huge amounts of borrowed money at the problems. Let me conclude by briefly observing how vital this combination of long-term planning and rational problem solving has been for the HKSAR. The crucial long-term plan for Hong Kong, created by China, which has fundamentally shaped the contours of the British Joint Declaration, Sino-British Joint Declaration, and more importantly, the Basic Law, is of course the remarkable one country, two systems formulation. One country, two systems has on occasions been subject to extreme stress testing. In mid-2019, we experienced an exceptionally violent and destructive insurgency in Hong Kong. It spun off from a series of major protest marches and lasted for many months. The level of violence and destruction during the insurrection grew so intense that many in Hong Kong, myself included, what may become of the HKSAR. The central government in Beijing chose to watch and observe and ultimately deal with these grave threats to fundamental stability once basic order was re-established by relying on essentially legal means, the new national security law and recent electoral reforms, both of which have been applied within the one country, two systems framework. There's no question these are radical reforms to the broad Hong Kong legislative framework, but they are considered and measured reforms. They are above all designed to, one, ensure that an insurrection such as we experienced in 2019 cannot happen again. Two, to reform and recast the basic political foundations in Hong Kong to protect one country, two system. And three, to ensure that the HKSAR is well placed to make the very best of its future within China. What we've experienced in Hong Kong in response to the immense challenges generated in 2019 is the crucial application of rational, complex problem solving set within a primary overall plan, one country, two systems. That same experience also confirms the acute observation of the British philosopher John Gray, who argued almost 20 years ago, if you want to be free, you need first to be safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cullen. I think you mentioned a very interesting thing, that a book about China was published in 2018. If it is published this year, I think lots of its conclusions or descriptions will be changed, because we haven't seen something like this before in, I don't know, in 100 years or 500 years. An unprecedented global pandemic hit the earth, and I think it changed a lot of people's perceptions about the world, about China. And I remember the New York Times has a headline that is very interesting. It says, the COVID-19 hasn't become China's Chernobyl, as many people would expect. It has become America's Waterloo. which is quite interesting. I mean, the pandemic is still going on right now, so it's very hard to see how far it will go and how much deeper its impact will be. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's early days yet, but I'm sure that the lessons coming, especially from the COVID pandemic, are going to be crystallised and become more clear. The way that China responded, notwithstanding controversies at the outset, but let's remember, China was the first mover. China was the first that had to deal with this problem. I suppose one way of thinking about this, to put it sort of into figures, is if China had reacted to COVID the way that America reacted to COVID, the death toll in China would be around about 2.5 million people. And it's not because they did a much better job. But there'll be a lot of argument about this, and that's good to see.
Yes, it's an event that is still going on. Anyways, thank you very much, Professor Coullin. And now may I have Mr. Pasquino, Senior Fellow of CNRS France and Professor of Department of Politics, New York University, the US, to express his view through video. Please.
It was created 100 years ago in Shanghai in a house located in the French Concession, and it is with the German Social Democratic Party, one of the oldest still existing political party in the entire world. In its long history, it underwent inevitably a number of transformations, shaping in a relevant way evolution and deep changes in the most populated nation in the world. In my short remarks, I'll focus on the last period of this extraordinary travel, which from the point of view I'm familiar with, meaning political and constitutional theory, and which is at the same time remarkable, but not yet entirely clear, at least to Western observers, especially to those who were familiar with the China of Mao. I don't need to remind the public of this meeting what both China's leaders and citizens have been able to achieve in economic development since the governance of Deng Xiaoping. No doubt, as the great economic historian Alexander Gershengorn wrote many years ago, Deng's China once abandoned the Soviet economic model, was able to take advantage of its economic underdevelopment to realize a huge leap forward. The 700 and perhaps more million people who were rescued from poverty is definitely the greatest and astonishing achievement by the party in the last decades. In a sense, more surprising is that the party was able to survive and to make his modernizing transformation after the collapse of the Soviet system, and to give birth to a new regime that we still need to understand closely. By we, I mean Western politicians and political scientists, as well as the Chinese themselves. It may be true in China too that it is too early to describe the specific nature of a political system which has no equivalent in the past and in the present. Nonetheless, I'll try to say what I understand and with which question I'm struggling in my effort to explain, at least to myself, the nature of contemporary Chinese political and constitutional order. A first point, the easiest one to grasp, is that the party was able to change largely its ideology and possibly its structure without denying or rejecting explicitly its past. The abrupt and radical abandonment and rejection of its political past after 1989 did not help at all Russia to improve either the regime or the life condition of its citizens. Then instead promoting a quite radical transformation of Chinese economy, often speaking with a big picture of Mao behind his shoulders. A remarkable example of Chinese old wisdom, which let me think of the English culture that invented modern parliamentarism, never abandoning its traditional monarchy. It just transformed monarchy in a dignified and ornamental piece of the system. Another important change that I personally experienced during my visit in China was the continuing transformation of the identity of the party from a political actor, the authority of which was rooted in the revolutionary ideology and political experience of Mao, into a meritocratic elite able to govern the country in the interest of the large majority of the citizens, and nobody can deny that. Here, I can touch upon this topic in meritocracy only in passing. Still, I want to spend a few words about this important but ambiguous and controversial question. Meritocracy is definitely part of all of the great culture and civilization and of their ideal of a good government. The ancient Roman Republic, for instance, was proud of a mechanism crucial in selection of the individuals exercising public authority, a mechanism called in Latin cursus honorum. This expression referred to the rule according to which, to access political function, a Roman citizen had to go through a number of inferior public magistracy, meaning public functions, to show its ability to govern in public interest. The citizens, even from an aristocratic family, could not jump directly to the most important governmental position without going up step by step and showing his qualities and capabilities to pretend more relevant roles. This model is somehow alive and I believe encouraged by the Chinese party as to the internal career. In a very old and linguistically high sophisticated culture as the Chinese one, meritocracy was strictly connected with the general system of competitive exams. Consider, moreover, something a little less well known. When the representative government was introduced in the United States at the end of the 18th century, the mechanism of elections to select the member of public authority was chosen because the founding fathers believed, following the classical Aristotelian doctrine, that the elections were the best mechanism to choose an elite, meaning the member of the community more able to govern political community in common interests. The equalitarian dimension introduced later on by the universal suffrage, mostly in the 20th century, overcame and obfuscated the original conception, which stressed instead the meritocratic elitist element of the electoral legitimacy. Unfortunately, in contemporary Western societies, elections seem to present nowadays some worrisome aspects. Contrary to what James Madison in America and Emmanuel Sieyès in France used to think, it may happen not only that the voters select someone like Angela Merkel, but also leaders like Berlusconi or Trump, whom not I, but the British magazine The Economist did not hesitate to qualify as not fit to govern. Meritocracy, I said, is a complex and somehow ambiguous concept, but in China, like in Europe and in the United States, no sensible person wishes to be governed by incompetent leader or able only, like some people are, of being re-elected to keep their power position. There is no doubt that both China and the West need competent government and governmental leaders. That the elections are the guarantee of such a good choice become, unfortunately, an uncertain outcome, at least in my generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pasquino. 下面有请全球未来研究所创始人和 CEO 陈子俊，马来西亚学者，他来发言。Next, may I invite Mr. Chandra Nair, founder and CEO of Global Institute for Tomorrow, please.
Thank you. So maybe it's my culture, but I feel I should stand up and be respectful for the audience. So allow me to stand up and say a few words. Because if I sit down also, I feel a bit cramped. So let me start by saying that most of what we've heard today I found very enlightening. We've heard about the great achievements of China under the CCP. We've heard also about the challenges that China will face as it's confronted with different ideological systems, the tensions with the West. What I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about is how do other people who are not in the Western world feel about China, and what obligations and responsibilities does China have, and the opportunities that the CCP has to address some of these concerns. So that's where I would like to come from. So before I get there, you might say, well, what does this guy know about China? Why is he interested? Well, I've been living in Hong Kong for a long time. Not as long as Mr. Zeman here, but long enough. But really, I come from Southeast Asia, from a very small country called Malaysia. My parents are originally from India. When I was growing up, the Vietnam War was raging in Southeast Asia. As members of the Commonwealth under the British Empire and under the influence of the American influence, etc., I was brought up fearing the communists. Everything I heard was those nasty communists are going to get us. So those of you who know history will know that there was something called the domino theory, that as soon as Vietnam fell, aided by the Chinese, then they would come to Thailand, they would come to Malaysia and sweep across Southeast Asia, and we'd all be living under those conditions of the horrible communist Chinese. This is true. This is what my whole teenage years were about. Then, as life goes on, I went to Africa for a few years as part of my work and studies, etc. And I noticed, and I landed in Africa in the 80s, where the liberation wars were at their peak, particularly in southern Africa. And I noticed that everyone who was fighting for liberation in southern Africa, from Angola to Mozambique to Namibia to Zimbabwe, were all called communists. And they were all supported apparently by nasty communists, Chinese, the Soviet Union, the Cubans. This made me realize essentially the word communism and communists were aligned with essentially a narrative to demonize people who were fighting for freedom. That anyone who was fighting for freedom against imperial powers were essentially called terrorists or communists. And in my own country, we had what was called a communist insurgency, which is essentially an insurgency led to essentially dismantle British colonial rule. So thereby I understood that there was an ideological obsession by demonizing countries. And today we see how China is being demonized. Long story short, that led me to a great interest in this country called China. I was sitting in Africa for the first time. Being brought up in Malaysia, of course, I was very close to Chinese culture. I learned to eat with chopsticks and char siu pao and all of that at the age of 3. So Chinese weren't alien. But to meet real Chinese people from the PRC, that was different. So I got to meet some of them, I got to study with some of them, and I began to understand different things, and I wanted to get to know a lot more. That brought me to Hong Kong, and then the rest is history. Over the last 25 years being in Hong Kong, I've had the privilege of having a front row seat to, I think, the greatest revolution in terms of economic and social change in the 20th and 21st century. The transformation of China and all the numbers we've heard about the number of people, unprecedented in human history. I've also had the privilege of traveling widely across China, from Yunnan right through to Qinghai, right through to Gansu province, to Hebei, most parts of China. I've traveled on trains, railways, camels, etc. And I have some very close friends in China, both Han Chinese, but also, interestingly, from the minority groups, from the Muslim community, and also very close friends of the Tibetan communities. And I've begun to understand a lot more about what's going on in China in the last 10 years or so. So now I'd like to then talk about what does China have to do going forward. China is very big. And what I understood is that as China grows, the ideological media war that we're all witnessing every day, every time you turn on the news, etc., suggests that this war is not going to cease very quickly. So there is need for a campaign of a Chinese softer approach, which President Xi talked about only, I think, 2 weeks ago, called for a softer approach. I think amongst friends I can say that I was speaking to someone very senior from a large Chinese tech company, you can guess, and she was saying to me, you know, we Chinese are not good at PR. I think we can say that among friends, right? So China needs better PR. And I think these are the areas where China needs to address the concerns of the smaller, because everyone's looking for China to fall and slip and be demonized. And in that regard, I think China has both the ability, for all the reasons we said the CCP acts by searching for the truth from the facts, the ability to get organized and mobilized, and the ability to serve the community and increasingly the global community. Because China is so big, there is no denying that China's rise has impacts all over the world. We would be foolish to not acknowledge that. Those impacts can be viewed through different lenses. All of us can see those differently. But I want to go back to Southeast Asia from where I come from. So China has a long history of association with populations in Southeast Asia. Many of us do not demonize China as it's demonized in other places because we understand. But I think China must reach out to understand the concerns because it's so big. So we've heard most of the day people talk about what China needs to do inside, and it's done a fantastic job, unparalleled. Now the challenge is, what does China do to help the world both respect it, attain its position as a global leader, and ensure its detractors do not find ways to demonize it? And in that, I see three things that China needs to do in terms of both taking that responsibility, that obligation, but its ability to change. And in that, I think we are now entering the post-Western world. And China is leading that. The troubles we had in Hong Kong, I've written about this, I've said, Hong Kong became the orphan child of the birth of the post-Western world. And the post-Western world will be looking very differently as China expands. But none of us want to see China misbehave or behave in ways that large powers can. And I think China is very conscious of it. So here are three areas that I think China should really be very careful, seek good advice from its friends, and through the ability of the party to get organized, have a clear path. The first one is, as China rolls out the Belt and Road Initiative around the world, and we believe to help economic growth, not stifled by ideological beliefs that the World Bank, etc., used to impose, it needs to ensure that the development of the One Belt, One Road initiative is even and sustainable. What I mean by that is there's a lot of criticism in the world I inhabit in terms of development, economics, etc., that China is essentially pushing ahead unconcerned. A lot of this is, of course, exaggerated, as we all know, but China needs to be very careful. In that regard, on the sustainable front, China needs to look at the whole issue of coal-built power plants, etc., and particularly the nature of resource utilization in these countries. The accusation that those who detract from China will accuse it of is that it expands and it needs resources, it will extract from other places. China needs to be very careful because then it'll be accused of being a new imperial power. And that too needs to be very carefully adjusted. So one is One Road, One Belt, very important, can alleviate poverty around the world, etc., but needs to be done very carefully because China is so big. And its agents of change outside need to be well informed about this threat. So that's one. The second one is, of course, I think China will play the leading role in terms of addressing the existential threat of climate change. There is no doubt about it. Of course, if you listen to the G7, etc., there's just criticism of China. But those of us, and I come from a science background and environmental background, the steps China has taken are extraordinary. China should lead the world, and hopefully in partnership with the US and Europe. And that will fundamentally change. But that's also linked to my first point about even development and sustainable development through One Road, One Belt. I don't think that's discussed enough because that's a real threat if China doesn't follow through. And I think I'm very, very reassured when people keep saying the CCP listens. And if there's anyone who has access to the top leadership, please, this is very important. The third thing is how China essentially impacts resource utilization around the world. And so one area that will give you a great example, if any of you have not read it, go and read a foreign policy article last week around the Chinese fishing fleets around the world. It's hugely exaggerated in some parts in terms of what it accuses China of, but we can't run away from the fact that the Chinese fishing fleets are huge. They're the largest in the world. The fisheries resources of the world are threatened. Here again, I think China can lead with the CCP saying at a policy level, we do not want to decimate the fisheries around the east coast of Africa, etc., being accused of a new form of colonization. And the Chinese government, I believe, can do this. But because it's so large, it has commercial interests or private interests going around the world, damaging the image of China. So I think fisheries is one area where China must take steps and lead its initiative. And there are already established forums like the Marine Stewardship Council, etc., that China can. But if you read that article, you will see how easy it is for China's interests, for resource needs, etc., can be completely used to make China look some sort of evil empire. So that's very important. And the last thing I want to say in finishing off is China must lead the world through this very difficult time of the creation of a framework for a post-Western world. The whole sort of rules-based Western system is essentially past its sell-by date. We can all criticize it in different ways, but there's an inevitability that we are moving into a new rules-based order. It's not led by the West. This will be a struggle for the next 20 years, and China, for all the reasons we've discussed, can be part of it. But it needs to bring the other smaller countries together with it and essentially also not simply be driven by its self-interest. So to finish off, I think, in terms of the next 100 years of the CCP, the Chinese system, would be to address these issues in a way that understands that smaller nations will be essentially worried if China doesn't essentially spread its influence in an even way. We all know when large countries arise, there are ripple effects. And that, I think, the CCP needs to be very conscious of. And to do that, my main point is there needs to be, I think, at the highest level, they understand. But right across China, particularly in business interests, etc., there needs to be a mindset shift. And there, too, I think the CCP can influence mindsets so that companies that go into Southeast Asia, go to Africa, etc., are very conscious of their obligation and the reputation of China if they behave badly. And this, I think, is something that is not discussed enough. And therein, I'll finish off by saying, I think it was so important that President Xi 2 weeks ago said, we need to be smarter in telling our story, but we can't just have propaganda. We need to follow the facts. We need to follow the science. And then we need action, and we need a softer approach. So those would be my points to share, and to wish the Chinese government and the CCP 100 more years of even sustainable development and caring for the rest of the world in partnership with the great powers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chandra. Speaking of the relationship between the West and China, I'm a news anchor, so 2 days ago I was reporting on one piece of news. The NATO listed China as the systematic challenge to NATO for the first time in history. Well, China is probably the furthest country from the Atlantic Ocean, and they have to do that. And I remember the Secretary of NATO spoke to the media before entering the meeting room, say China is not an enemy or a competitor. But after the meeting with Biden, everything changed. Anyways, I think pointing fingers is always easy. You said when you grew up, communism is never a good word. Yes, that's interesting, because when I was growing up, capitalism is never a good word.
Exactly.
It's even worse than Kuomintang, whatever. Yeah. I was growing up in Shenzhen, and when I was 16 or 17, we had an English teacher from America, and he's very disappointed, because he said, this is not what I think about China, this is Los Angeles. So, well, he's from Tennessee, so I understand now. Anyways, I think the more we travel, the more we learn, the more we find about the misunderstandings between different people.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just say, I think we need to understand why the G7 and all of them behave the way they do. The anxiety of, and I know it's cliched to talk about the Western Alliance, but for want of a better word, I'll call it the Western Alliance. I mean, the anxiety I understand. But with the greater, over the span of history, what we need to understand is that for the first time in perhaps 400 or 500 years, a Western civilization is confronted with the rise of a non-Western civilization. You have to look at history. So for 500 years, the world has known nothing but the domination of Western civilization over the rest of the world. We can talk about all the atrocities, etc., but that is the world in which Western democracies essentially have thrived on. To lose that dominance is very difficult. So I understand their pain, but it does not excuse the behavior of trying to hold back other countries like China. The question for me will be, how will China behave, which is what I talked about. And that's where I think the CCP's ideology, the Chinese culture, becomes so important so that they don't repeat those mistakes. But you've got to understand that the Western, the NATO and all of that is essentially an inability to come to terms with the loss of power. And that's fundamental to understand.
Well, thank you very much. That's an interesting topic. Okay, next, may we please invite Mr. Alan Zeman, Chairman of Lan Kuei Fund Group, Hong Kong, to give us a speech. Thank you. Okay. There's no sound.
Working now? Yeah,
Yeah.
now we're working. Okay, on live. Okay, it's been a very interesting morning for everyone, and starting the afternoon. And I was sitting and listening to all the speakers and thought about what I could say and what I could talk about. basically, for myself, I've been in Hong Kong for 50 years. So I've seen the British under the British administration. But I thought I'd like to talk about, since this is the 100th anniversary of CCP coming up. I've been in China for 45 years. I actually had my first office in Changsha, Hunan, 45 years ago. And I remember one day, Zheng Qihua said to me, "Why did you choose Changsha of all places?" And I said to him, because I was a young man, I was at that time I had a trading company, supply chain management. We were exporting from different countries. And I looked at China, and that was the birthplace of Chairman Mao. And for a young man, I thought to myself, that's head office of China in those years. And so why not open up an office there? Well, if today's world is just so different. In those years, China was such a different place of what we know today. The life, things we take for granted today, was so different in those years. There was limited food to eat. We stayed in the hotel. We had an office in the hotel. And literally, the breakfast was from 5:30 in the morning till 6:30, and then the chef would go home. Lunchtime was 11:30 to 12:15, and then nothing. And we used to come down in the morning for breakfast, and if you were a little bit late, we had to go into the kitchen of the hotel to open up the refrigerator. There was no food. There was nothing there, basically. So you learned about the scarcity of the old way of China that was not so long ago, but it really, really opened my eyes to how China changed. And in the evening in the hotel, electricity was very bad, used to come on and off. So the electricity used to go off maybe sometimes at 4:30, 5 o'clock, 5 p.m., what to do. So we used to play ping pong by candlelight. And that was just a real experience that really taught me about the difficulty, the hardships that China experienced in those years. In order to get to Hunan from Hong Kong, there was two ways. Either the train, which was 14 hours overnight, sitting on the hard seats with the PLA. If you were lucky, you could pay off someone, a conductor, and they had one sleeper car with two uppers and two lowers, and usually reserved for military. And used to smoke all night. If you got one, they used to smoke all night. So when you woke up, I had hair in those years, you'd wake up in the morning and your hair, your clothes, everything smelled of smoke. So it was very, very, very difficult. And the other way was the airplane. The airplane took 2 hours, Russian Ilyushin airplanes by propeller. No air conditioning. They used to give you a fan. The food was just a candy, no meals. They had a refrigerator in there. And it was just a totally different world. One time I came there, I was the last passenger on the airplane out of Guangzhou, and gave the stewardess my boarding pass, and she told me that your seat's taken, somebody's sitting here. And I played dumb Western face, Guaylo face. I don't understand. I didn't want to get off the plane because it was 14 hours on the train again. So all they did, she took necessity, the mother of invention. She took a small stool, put it in the center aisle, sit down there, no seat belt, nothing. Today, I would never, ever do anything like that. But when you're young, you do a lot of crazy things. But you improvise. You did things in China. And you start to learn the difficulty that people faced. And things that we take for granted today, in order to make a phone call out of Changsha at the time, today we have a mobile phone. You just pick it up and you call your friend or you call wherever you want. We had to book a telephone call 2 days in advance. And the operator just go from Changsha to Shanghai to Beijing, the old switchboard operator that they used to put the cable into the board. And so it really, you had to plan everything. Everything was totally, totally different. And technology, of course, was non-existent. There's not very many cars on the road. Today, of course, China is the #1 automobile place in the world. In those years, very, very limited cars. People didn't travel much. And then I watched over the years the changes that took place in China. And I did business in many, many different provinces. I love China because every city had a different culture. Although it's one country, but it's made up of so many different, basically, cultures. And that's what made it so interesting. And I found just looking at each part of China was beautiful. It was like traveling on a train. You'd look at through the window, and even though it was fields, it looked like, in my mind, like a painting. Just beautiful, just untouched. But the only thing was doing business in those years in China was the bureaucracy. That can drive you mad. And also, in those years, the corruption was quite prevalent. I had offices in 36 countries around the world that I built. Hong Kong was my head office. So I had experience in dealing in many, many different countries. But in many of the developing countries in those years were quite corrupt because salaries were low and just people had to live. You learned what it was at that time. But I saw the changes that took place in China. All that changes. And suddenly in 1978, a short leader comes in to power, Deng Xiaoping. And he was a brilliant man. He was all brain, literally. Decided we need to open up China. We need to change things. And he presented a picture that China must change. I remember in those years, Hong Kong people were very, very nervous. Oh my God, we're going from British rule back to China. And people didn't know what to do. And Deng Xiaoping comes up with something. If a cat is black, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, it's a good cat. And so suddenly came up with one country, two systems. Don't worry, you'll have your system, everything will be okay. And so people started to relax because we could have our system. The big problem with the system was in the history of the world, there's never been one country, one city going back from one country to another. And so there's no template for it. And so really when 97 came, it was like the Wild West. Everybody had a different idea of what Hong Kong needs to be. Young people didn't know, am I Chinese? Am I Hong Kongese? Am I British? Am I American? Because there's no template for it. And China at that time had hands off because they were not so familiar. No one was with one country, two systems. The problem that we made at the time was that every country needs to have national education. When I was growing up in Canada as a young man, every morning when I was in school, saluted the British flag and sang God Save the Queen. In US, you put your hand on your heart and you pledge allegiance to the flag. In China, of course, again, you grow up singing the national anthem. So everybody has an identity. In Hong Kong, unfortunately, we had no identity. Everything, one country, two systems. China had the idea that one country comes first. Hong Kong people had the idea that two systems comes first. Because I still say the majority of Hong Kong people have never been to China and have not seen the miracle, and not just Hong Kong people, but the rest of the world, the Western world. Very, very few people have been to China. And so they still remember the old days of communism. And that's been a huge problem that, that they haven't seen. And when Deng Xiaoping, I was there when Deng Xiaoping came to Shekau in Shenzhen, and it was all basically field farms. And he said, this is going to become a special economic zone. And I thought to myself, I don't know what he's talking about, but how can Shenzhen be a special economic zone? Now, for those of you that have been to Shenzhen, it's unbelievable. It's one of the great cities in the world. It's the most dynamic city. It leads the world in technology. I believe it's further ahead than Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley was the start of it, but Shenzhen has moved way beyond it. And so this was all because of China's opening up. And so when I was at the same time, I was in Shanghai at the time when Zhu Rongji was in power in 1991. And I remember standing there, and he was looking across the river and saying Puxi. We were in Puxi, and he's looking, and it's like he was looking across, and he's saying that Pudong is going to be the financial center of Shanghai. And I thought to myself, there's no way. Again, it's all farmland. But those of you that have been to Shanghai today, Pudong is incredible. All the tall buildings, the financial center, everything that they do, that's the power of China. That's why China has been able to move so quickly. And today, when I was experiencing the changes taking place, look at China, the airports in China. Every city, in the old days, we used to fly in, and the airports were old, and it was a different system. Today, if you look at Beijing Daxing International Airport, take it as an example, it's one of the most advanced airports in the world. Guangzhou has most passengers in the world. I mean, we just keep going on. I sit on the Hong Kong Airport Authority Board, and I can tell you, of course, we're very proud of our Hong Kong airport, but literally every city in China has airports. I went back to the US 5 or 6 years ago. I hadn't been there for many, many years. New York LaGuardia Airport hasn't changed. Los Angeles Airport hasn't changed. The infrastructure is falling apart. Still, the bridges are still the same as when I left them, the Midtown Tunnel. China's infrastructure is amazing. The life of the people got better and better over the years. That was something that I experienced. And so the CCP is actually celebrating its 100th year anniversary. The governance of China, especially, is really one of the most admired systems in the world as far as I'm concerned, because it's the most misunderstood system. But with 1.4 billion people, that system, when you have that many people, that system really works. Because in 40 years, no other system has been able to take 600 million people out of poverty, lifted 600 million people out of poverty, and created a strong middle class, which is double the size of the United States. And so they have spending power. The system has become the model, to me, the model for the world. Because now, after President Xi came into power, he cleaned up corruption, he did everything possible, had a vision for the country, the way forward, and his vision has been followed. And we can see he doesn't want to depend just on GDP by export for GDP. He's now going for domestic spending, so they don't have to rely on the U.S. after all the problems that they had with tariffs, with the wars, with all that kind of thing. And then I look at the system in the U.S., which was before the American dream. Everybody looked up to the American dream. Today, I call it the American nightmare. The system actually is broken. The system, Western democracies, as we know it, really does not work It's not what we were taught. It's not what we envisioned. As other speakers have said, when I was growing up, I was taught communism is bad. But you know, China is communist, but it's socialist. Communism has changed. And it's not only socialist, but what China has, it has capitalism, which we see the top tier, like Alibaba, Jack Ma, we have Tencent, JD.com, all the giant companies now, Huawei, all the companies in China, which are all basically capitalist, but with socialist principles. And then on the other hand, you have the middle class and the lower class, which practices socialism. And that's really what has given the life for the 600, for people, brought them out of poverty and gave them a much better life in China. Today, the people in China have, as far as I'm concerned, because I have many offices in China, my staff live better than many people here in Hong Kong, and then better than most places in the world. The United States, for argument's sake, they have capitalism, which is the Republican Party, and just care about the top 3, 4, 5%. The rest of the population, the Democrats, are socialistic. They care about the middle class and the lower class. The lower class in the U.S. today are living in tents because nobody cares about them. The black population is still slaves in the United States. So that system does not work and needs a lot of adjustment. The problem that we face at the moment, of course, is the backlash of Western countries. As Chandran has said, the Western countries, democracies, worry about the rise of China. And that's something that is understandable. But if you go back in history, you look at the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, they all were on top at one time, and then things changed. The future for China is just immense. And I can tell you, the system of which President Xi has done, it's amazing. And then China's changing dramatically. And what really changed China, and I can see the changes of the people, 2 months ago, we had the summit between the U.S. and China in Alaska. And at that time, you had Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi that were there. In the past, the U.S. used to scold China for about an hour, usually, to tell them how their system was not good. They're worried about human rights. They're worried about Hong Kong, all the other things that they could put together. But at that time, the first time that I've ever seen Chinese leaders say, hold on a minute. Before you lecture us, let us tell you, look at your system. Fix your system first before you come and tell us what to do about our system. We're very proud of our system because our system really does work. And that's because of the Chinese Communist Party, the system that really has worked. And as we saw earlier, there was and after that, when they went back to China, the face, and I could see a change in all the Chinese people suddenly feeling very proud. In the past, I always felt a bit of inferiority of Chinese people towards Westerners because they always thought the Americans, the Western way was the right model. But I could see the change now that our model really, really does work. And in 2008, I saw the changes. I was so confident about China. I had a Canadian passport. I changed my passport to a Chinese passport. I had to give up my Canadian passport. So I was all in because I see the future. And the future is China. And I was proud to be Chinese by nationality, although I don't have a Chinese face. But inside, I'm Chinese. My passport, my nationality is Chinese, says Chinese. I always have problems when I go through borders. Thank you. Because usually the immigration official in the United States or somewhere else looks at me and says, you don't look Chinese. And I tell them it's a genetic problem. It's easier. Easier to tell them that. But now, the rest of the world is looking through China through different eyes. It'll take time. China needs the soft power in order to bring where people can see their system. China does not want to expand their system around the world. China's just happy, as we know, the Chinese Communist Party is the party of the people, and really cares about the people, cares about making their life easier. Everyone has opportunity for people who want to be capitalists and people who want to be socialist and really improving their lifestyle. And so that's why I look at the future of China and I just see only bright things ahead for China. And since we don't have so much time, I see very bright things for Hong Kong alongside in the new patriotic people who will govern Hong Kong. And that's a whole other discussion, but I can go into that. I know we don't have enough time. But one thing I want to leave you with, that in the past, the East always looked to the West to get inspiration. In the next 10, 15 years, the West will be looking to the East more and more. So we can all hold our head up high, because going into the future, I can tell you, this is the place to be. And I tell all young people, the way I came out here when I was a young man and made my fortune out here, I tell all young people, if I had to do it all over again, I'd be in China today. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zimmer. I remember President Xi Jinping during this year's the National Congress meetings. He was talking to some of the representatives. He said, nowadays, you young people go abroad, you really can see the world through a horizontal angle. Not like us. When we went abroad like 20 years ago, we feel we are so out of fashion. Like 我很土，我们很土. But nowadays the kids, they can choose to 平视这个世界, not looking down, not looking up. But all we want is just to look at the world on an equal, fair angle. I think that's quite moving, actually.
It's very true. And I've always said, I have a slogan, travel makes you smart. The more you travel, the more you see other cultures and understand other countries, you come back home and you adapt some of the culture to your own culture, and it makes you stronger and stronger. And I've always known that. I always traveled as a young man because I had so many offices and understood the different cultures in different countries, and you can really appreciate what you have. And that's one thing I hope everybody does, continue to travel.
Thank you. Also, you spoke of soft power. Last week, also, there's a very big meeting promoting international communication skills from top to the levels to everyone needs to learn how to communicate with others more peacefully, I think. Anyways, we have limited time, so let's move on. Next, we're going to have a video speech, and please invite Mr. John Ross, former Director, Department of Economy and Business Policy in London, UK, to talk to us via video.
Firstly, thank you very much for the honour to speak on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the CPC. I want to explain that is not just polite words, it really is an honour. I'd like to start by the fact I don't know how many people here have actually been to the rooms in Shanghai where the CPC was founded. Well, I have actually. And it's really rather inspiring because you see how few people were there at the origins, only really a handful of people. Yet within 28 years, these people had led a party which had created a new state. And 70 years after that, China has been taken, as I will outline, from one of the poorest countries in the world to the brink of being a high-income economy by international standards. There is very few examples in history of how ideas of a small number of people could be translated in such a short period of time into such a huge organizational force with such consequences from the world. Okay. Obviously, people in China look at the question of the CPC fundamentally from a national viewpoint. And this is obviously correct, because the great pledge which the CPC made to China was that it would lead to the national rejuvenation of China. So I don't want to take away from that perspective at all, but I think it's also useful to make some international comparisons, because that gives you not merely an indication of what is the scale of the CPC's achievement, but I think it actually casts some indication on the national viewpoint itself. If we go back and see it, the way that I would see it is the following. In 1949, the CPC made a promise to the Chinese people. It said, if you adopt our program, our methods, and the path that we propose, the century of humiliation of China, which started with the invasions of the Opium Wars, will be brought to an end, and China will regain its place in the world, not as better than any other country, but with no other country being better than China. This I take to be the meaning of the famous words of Mao Zedong in 1949, the Chinese people have stood up. And these were symbolized, for, not to say, when with the founding of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong did not say, now we will have extremely fast economic growth, or now we will take revenge for all the crimes which have been committed against China during the last 100 years. This phrase, the Chinese people have stood up, meant exactly what it said. It meant that after a century in which China was subject to endless humiliations and incredible attacks, I mean, we should never forget that in the period between the first Opium War and the founding of the People's Republic of China, almost 100 million people died in China as a result either of direct effects of foreign intervention or indirect effects, civil wars, famines, and other things. This was an extraordinary suffering, anyway, that can be described of the Chinese people. And what the CPC said is, if you adopt our methods and our program that we propose for the Chinese people, this period will be brought to an end, and China and the Chinese people will regain their position as respected a nation as any other in the world. The only decisive conclusion that can be drawn after 100 years is that the CPC delivered exactly that promise. Indeed, I would put it very simply that the social and economic achievements of China since the founding of the People's Republic of China, which are of course led by the CPC, are the largest of any country in the whole of human history, and have improved the position of the largest number of people and the largest proportion of humanity of any country in human history. Those are very serious statements, and then this type of thing is not to be made as a rhetoric. So I'm going to really try to prove this. Okay. Firstly, in the situation in 1949, foreign armies had trampled across China for a century. I did recently a program, one of these year review programs, and looking ahead, in which I said, for young people in China, sometimes don't realize how lucky they are, because foreign intervention and foreign threats for their grandparents, this was not a theory, was not a potential. For 100 years, foreign armies had trampled upon China, starting with the British, then with whole sorts of international groupings, then with Japan, and this had been brought a stop to. Now, actually, I was very pleased to see that the young people of China did understand what an enormous achievement this was, because I said this had been brought to an end. And these words actually received more applause than anything else which I'd said, which I'd not quite expected. But they did understand what a gigantic achievement had been created by the CPC. Okay, so what I want to look at is look at some of the international comparisons that could be made on this. The first is China has achieved this economic and social step forward for by far the biggest proportion of humanity in human history. In 1949, China was almost the poorest country in the world. If you take the study by Angus Maddison, who's the world's leading expert on long-term economic growth and per capita GDP, he finds in 1949 there are only 10 countries in the world which were poorer in per capita GDP than China. If we go forward now, 71 years, and then you took at it from the point of view of today, that is within a single lifetime, in just over 70 years, in a single lifetime, China has gone from almost the poorest country in the world to being, by international standards, on the brink of being a high-income economy. By China's domestic criteria, China has already achieved what it calls moderate prosperity. But it's probably simpler from the point of view of making international comparisons to take the World Bank's definition of a high-income economy. If you look at that, China will become a high-income economy by World Bank standards in either 2022 or 2023. But look at the scale of transformation that this means for humanity. At the present time, only 16% of the world's population lives in high-income economies. But China by itself is almost 18% of the world's population. So China becoming a high-income economy means that the number of people living in high-income economies in the world will more than double. And this is not just a question of abstract questions of per capita GDP. We know that the economic development, it determines life expectancy, it determines the availability of education, it determines the availability of health, the availability of culture, and numerous other criteria for human well-being. So China will, in only 70 years, have gone from almost the poorest country in the world to doubling the number of people who are living in high-income economies. There is no other country in history which has ever achieved this. I could make you a few international comparisons. The first country which ever underwent rapid economic development was my own country, Britain, with the Industrial Revolution. At that time, Britain was slightly over 2% of the world's population. If we go forward to the next very major country to experience rapid economic growth, it was the United States after its Civil War. The United States at that time was slightly more than 3% of the world's population. If we go forward to what up until now has been the fastest and biggest example of rapid economic development, it was actually the Soviet Union after 1929, which was about 8% of the world's population. But China, when it began to undergo rapid economic growth in 1978, was 22% of the world's population, almost 3 times as much of humanity as any other country which had ever undergone rapid economic growth. This is literally an achievement without parallel in human history. Okay. What does that mean also from the point of view of the Chinese people? Well, economists know that the best overall indicator of social and economic conditions is average life expectancy, because average life expectancy takes all the good things, that is getting rid of poverty, good consumption, good education, good healthcare, good environmental conditions. It takes away all the negative ones, subtracts from the number that all the negative ones, that is poverty, poor healthcare, poor environmental conditions, poor education, etc. And it gives you a single number, which is average life expectancy. Now, China, even before the 1978 economic reforms, underwent probably the greatest social miracle, except it wasn't a miracle, it was a policy, in human history. People sometimes want to present, why does Mao Zedong have such authority in China? Well, leave aside the question of national reunification and stopping national oppression. Average life expectancy in China increased by 31 years during the period between 1949 and 1976, the death of Mao Zedong. Xi Jinping, this is a gigantic human miracle, and you can understand if somebody leads you to live 31 years longer than at the beginning of the process, you're likely to feel really rather well disposed towards them. And I think, therefore, it's very important what Xi Jinping has said, that, of course, the two periods of China's economic development after 1949, which were taken from the first being from 1949 and the establishment of the People's Republic, through to 1978 and the reform and opening up, and then from 1978 to present day, these are different from many points of view. They're different in method, they're different in policies. The CPC showed great adaptability, but both were gigantic periods of progress of the Chinese people. The first, as I said, was what I would describe as a social miracle. Average economic growth was satisfactory by most normal standards, but it was not super high. But the improvement in health, education, life expectancy of the Chinese people is the biggest of any major country in human history. And then, of course, in 1978 began what is the most rapid economic growth of any country in the whole of human history. From 1978 to the present day, the average growth of China has been 9.2%. No other country in human history has ever achieved such rapid economic development over such a long period of time. And this is not merely abstract, again, per capita GDP. It's not the, just concrete and steel. It's the fact that what this means is, for example, the average consumption of Chinese household consumption has increased by 1,800% since 1978. That is increased by 18 times. The next major country in the world after China is 900% in that period. That means that the average consumption, the average household daily meeting of needs of the Chinese average people has increased by 18 times in that period of time. If you look at poverty, China has very proudly, correctly announced in 2020 the elimination of absolute poverty in China. But again, I think it's useful to make an international comparison because the World Bank lays down an international standard for comparison of escape from absolute poverty. By that criteria, since 1978, China has lifted 853 million people out of poverty. That is 3 out of every 4 people in the world who were lifted from poverty. For every 4 people who were lifted from poverty in this period in the world, 3 of them were Chinese. This fact alone is enough to establish that China has made the greatest contribution to the development of human rights in the real meaning of that word of any country. And obviously, this was with the leadership of the CPC. Finally, some people tried to pretend, having all the data showing how incredible China's economic and social development is, they tried to invent things such, claim that social conditions are very bad. Well, we can judge this very simple again, because life expectancy is the most sensitive indicator of a country's overall social being. We know that per capita GDP is the single biggest contributor to this. Statistically, 73% of life expectancy is predicted by per capita GDP. But that still means that there are 27%, which is not accounted for by per capita GDP. And this is the effect of such things as the environmental situation, the health situation, the education situation, etc. So therefore, if you compare what you would expect a country's life expectancy to be, you'll find that for some countries it's lower than you would expect from per capita GDP. And in some countries it's higher than you would expect from per capita GDP. This is showing you that the overall social conditions are either better or worse than you would expect from the economy. For example, in the United States, you live 2 years less than you would expect from its per capita GDP. This is showing you the negative effect of various social conditions in the United States. In China, you live almost 3 years longer than you would expect from its level of per capita GDP. So again, this is showing you that the environmental conditions, the educational conditions, the social conditions are even better than the economic ones. Now, I don't mean by this, of course, to pretend there are no problems. China's achievements are so huge, there is no need to prettify them or exaggerate them or anything like that. They just have to be accurately stated. China still has to overcome certain of the problems which were created even by its very rapid economic development. If we go back 5 years, I know where I was living in Beijing that there were significant problems with air pollution, for example. These have got a lot better. China is now developing its own policies from the point of view of climate change. But nevertheless, what this data is showing you is that the environmental, educational, social conditions of the Chinese people are even better than what would be expected by the development of the economy. What led this? There's a simple explanation. It was, of course, the development of the CPC. All these statistical data are the way of showing that the CPC delivered the promise that it made to the Chinese people. That is, the Chinese people in 1949 decided to place their trust in the CPC and its methods and policies. And the CPC did not let the Chinese people down. It delivered what it was said it was going to do. And what did this produce? This produced the greatest improvement in the largest number of people and the greatest proportion of humanity in the whole of human history. That is what is the achievement of 100 years of the CPC. And that is why I'm both delighted and very honoured to be asked to speak on this subject. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Ross. Now, may I have Mr. Vladimir Petrovsky, Chief Researcher of Institute of Far Eastern Studies, Russian Academy of Science, and member of Russian International Affairs Council, to deliver a speech via video.
I'm really happy to be with us today for our conference to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China. I think this is really a historic event which we should celebrate together and consider the historic importance of this. As we celebrate this very special anniversary, we should consider that it is of the great importance not only for China, but really for the rest of the world. More than 70 out of 100 years of existence, the Communist Party of China was a really Marxist party, and which is a remarkable movement itself. So, to this extent, I think that the newest period of the Communist Party of China, which is, as you know, the period of openness and reform, should be specially considered to better understand what is really the importance of the CPC as a ruling party. And to better understand this, I think we should turn to the history of the second part of the 20th century and the first decade of this century, because, by the end of the 20th century, the future of socialism really depended on its ability and its capacity to reform itself. Which means that all those who were not able to do this, like the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union, they unfortunately ceased to exist. But those who were able and capable to do this, like the Communist Party of China, they now are the winners. And now they show the example to the rest of the world, especially to the Marxist and left-wing forces. And I would like to spend a few words just to try to compare the Russian, or better to say Soviet and Chinese experience to this extent. You know that by the end of 1980s, both of our countries found themselves basically at the very same crossroad, but each chose different path. The balance of economic reforms and political stability is the essence of any kind of reforms, including in Russia and in China. And I still remember as I was young, how liberal-minded people in Russia who admired economic achievements in China under the rule of Chairman Deng Xiaoping at that time, after its 19th Congress, the Communist Party of China, a new stage of the development. We see that political system is being adjusted, and the new generation of leaders, headed by Chairman Xi Jinping, is in place, and they set tasks for the party and for the country which must be solved. And actually, now we see that despite the negative impact of the coronavirus pandemic, China has successfully completed its 13th five-year plan. And by the last year, the country's GDP doubled compared to the year 2010 as it was pre-planned. And thus, another historic milestone was reached, and the Communist Party of China announced that a society of average prosperity has been built in China. And this is the age-old dream of the Chinese people, which has come true. The first task, of course, was to feed everyone, to take care of everyone, to save people from hunger, to provide a minimum standard of living. And first, China built a society of low prosperity. Now we have average prosperity, society which has been built, and soon we will see a completely new China with a large middle class that will express its political and economic interests. And so far, China will thus become a fully developed country, as it was pre-planned by the Communist Party of China. And I would also stress that one of the very essential parameters of the Chinese development model is its full compliance with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals until the year 2027, specifically the goals and objectives for reducing poverty. As Chairman Xi Jinping noted in the year 2018, over the 40 years of the period of openness and reforms, more than 700 million of poor people, according to the current UN standards, making up more than 70% of the total number of people in the world at this time, which means that China made a very significant contribution globally to reach this very important goal of the SDGs. China shows to everybody in the world that the Western standards and values are not universal in itself. That part of China concepts and specific of the common destiny of the social in the new era, the concept building a moderately, etc., etc. So we have the whole set of new concepts and ideas which have been very well accepted in the world, not only in China. And these provisions show that China is entering a very important transition period of its development. And it becomes more confident and more global player. Because why? Because the CPC leadership in the correctness of the policy and course which has been chosen, meaning to build socialism with China's characteristics. And everybody in the world is the steady growth of China's economy, which is the better proof for the correctness of these concepts and these ideas. And as a success, socialism is very much important in and market forces, but also still looking for their model of development So China maybe is the best example for them. The concept of the common destiny of mankind put forward reflects the Chinese vision of Chinese vision of the global international politics, which should be more harmonious, more sustainable, more fair, and to this extent, Russia completely supports this concept. Actually, this concept reflects the vision of the new world, of the future new world, should be a multipolar, a very innovative concept and initiative, which, as we know, consists of two key elements, which is the Silk Road economic belt, and this is specifically important for Russia and the post-Soviet countries. Those who belong to the Eurasian our countries consider the cooperation and, as we call it now, the conjunction between Eurasian integration and Silk Road economic belt. And of course, we see the maritime Silk Road of the 21st century. Moreover, we see the ice Silk Road or Polar Silk Road, which means the prospects of cooperation between Russia and China of how to explore the northern sea route in the Arctic. This Belt and Road Initiative can be presented as a kind of a global public good, as a platform of multilateral cooperation, corresponding to international rules, first of all, and then corresponding to the needs of national developments of those countries who wish to join. Now the Belt and Road Initiative is about 8 years old, and the experience of its practical implementation show that it has already played an exceptionally important role in the development of trade and cooperation in Eurasian and Asia Pacific, because again, on and very much interested to the Belt and Road Initiative strategy. And to this extent, Belt and Road Initiative is unique in the modern global economy and international relations, enabling various countries to develop. And occurred in the economic structure. The promotion of structural reforms is very much important. Promotion of supply demand is very much. Now we need to secure what the global chain of support and development. And to this extent, we should consider the concept of resilience. This is important. We should consider the concept of resilience of Chinese economy, the concept of resilience by Russian and Chinese relations, and more resilience for the global economy as we finally will get rid of this coronavirus pandemic hopefully soon. Just want to show what is the perception of the Party of China nowadays. Just an example. In Russia, a couple of years was asked by a certain media, and they were asking each and every just one question with the global in 100 years to come. Relation in 100 years. And do you think that in 100 years the communist of China will still exist? And why? Because the performance of the country of China is good, doesn't make mistakes, and performance is especially good in terms of the concept of good governance, which is much more wide only. That the Communist Party of China perceives itself as a servant for people. The idea is to be needs and in politics and social life. And as soon as the Communist Party of China, as a power, is
much 香港大学与公共行政学系副教授、国制度研究中心兼全国港澳研究会理事。Mr. Yan Xiaojun, Associate Professor of Department of Politics and Public Administration of the University of Hong Kong and Director of Research Hub Armed Institutions of China at the University of Hong Kong. He is also a member of Chinese Association of Hong Kong and Macau Studies of China. Mr. Yan, please.
Thank you. Thank the organizers of this forum for having me here today. It was a privilege to learn from the insight of my panelists here. This year marks celebration of the founding of the I agree and echo my panelists that this is a very important occasion, also a very important event. I think to reflect on the 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party, we need to probably first of all understand the experiences of China as a nation state in the past century. What did China experience in the past 100 years, especially since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949? I think there are at least three major transformations. Formed itself in the world to the second largest economy. When the Chinese Communist Party had its founding in one of the poorest countries of wars, but China is the leader of the global economy. But more importantly, I think the living standard of the new level in 1949 and probably even in 1978, only a few people in China had private cars. But today, when we sit in a traffic jam in Beijing, we claim that there are just many private cars in big cities in China. Secondly, I think China also experienced the leadership of the socialist market. The third transformation, I think, is China's transformation from, and this is an ongoing process. Have transformations as well. For example, internationally, China has formed a once marginalized member of the global community, and also a victim of Western colonialism and invasion to an increasingly important power on the international stage. So in my view, when we discuss transformation, we are reminded of the many kinds of transformation that took place. My point here is that when we are reflecting on the broad of China, we need to see the important when we are on the past 100 years of the party. A learning party, 学习型政党. In my view, over the past 100, especially over the past 70 years, is and attentive Chinese society, which is multicultural society in transformation that is full of wonders and surprises. In this learning and transformation process, the Chinese Communist Party has learned in many different fields. In the economic fields, I think the Communist Party is striving to make itself an effective and sometimes even magic maker of economic miracle. And this is the first sort of field of the Chinese Communist Party to learn. In the past 40 years of reform and opening up, we can probably trace it back to 1949 as well, that the Chinese Communist Party has persistently played as a realistic, adaptive, and successful planner, implementer, and regulator of the national economy. And also, the party is trying to adapt to an emerging economy. Economy of the 1950s to acknowledge in the 21st century. This is a huge transformation, but continues to learn. And also, in the morning that the party also recognizes the increasingly interest
I'm also aware through that time of how many communists around the world have dedicated their lives to the cause of socialism and communism, and how many indeed have given their lives in the cause of socialism and communism. I have learned very much more in recent years about the tremendous courage and perseverance and sacrifices of the communists of China. And therefore, in this centenary year of the CPC, and on behalf of all of our members in Britain, I salute the Communist Party of China. I salute its membership, I salute its leadership, and I look forward not only to further great advances within China for the Chinese people under their Communist Party leadership. I look forward to great benefits coming to other peoples around the world. I know that the Chinese communists and their government wish to benefit from mutually beneficial relations. And I look forward to a strengthening, a further renewal, a second renewal of the international communist movement. And perhaps I'll finish by saying again, one of my great pleasures in recent years, politically speaking, is to see the increased role that the CPC is playing in the international communist movement. We have our international meetings every year. We have our arrangements for coordination and preparation in between those meetings. And I think the way in which the Communist Party of China has come more to the fore, played a much bigger role in the proceedings of the meetings and in the organization and the preparation in between those meetings, and has stepped up its links and its relations with communist parties across the world, big and small. Even small parties such as ours are treated with absolute respect on the basis of equality and so on. I think the CPC is becoming a model as to how communist parties should conduct themselves in the wider international communist movement. So perhaps, with that tribute, that would conclude my salutations to the Communist Party of China in its 100th year. I have certainly been to China 5, 6, perhaps 7 times. Deep impression left by my visit to Xinjiang and to the capital city, to Urumqi. Went on little walks from our hotel, one of the most wonderfully advanced, luxurious hotels I've ever been to anywhere in the world, by the way. But when we left the hotel and walked around the local area, people in Britain think we must have been escorted by officials or by secret police or something like that. Well, of course, that's absolute nonsense. We went out and we walked in the area locally. We went to local markets. And of course, we heard everybody speaking a language that sounded nothing like Han Chinese. They were speaking the Uyghur language. The officials that we met from the city government and from the party in Xinjiang and Urumqi, almost all of them were Uyghur speaking. They had to bring their own interpreters because our interpreters from Beijing did not speak Uyghur. So everywhere we went, we saw the Uyghur language on the signs, on the notices. We heard the Uyghur language being spoken. The officials we spoke to and had meetings with, almost all of them, in fact, I think all of them spoke in the Uyghur language, translated then for us into English and so on. And then shortly after we came back to Britain, I opened a copy of the Guardian newspaper and read a report of a speech in the European Union Parliament by the leader of the so-called World Uyghur Congress, which I think was then based in the United States. It's based in Germany now, in which he was telling members of the European Parliament that the Uyghur language was banned, that all the notices and signposts in Xinjiang were in Han Chinese only, and that all of the top officials were Han Chinese and not Uyghurs. Well, we had just been there. We had seen that this was the complete opposite of the truth. After coming back from Xinjiang a few years ago, I would never automatically believe anything I read or hear or see in the Western media about what's occurring in Xinjiang, because I've seen how that can be so completely misrepresented. So being able to take part in discussions and meetings in Britain and to tell people of this personal experience, I think has, I think it is quite important. I think one only has to look at the enormous economic and social advances of recent decades in China to understand that clearly, without going into the fine details, the general policy lines of the Communist Party of China and the government of China have been to the great advantage of hundreds of millions of Chinese people. You know, the achievement lifting 700 million people out of poverty, out of absolute poverty in recent decades. I think that is about, when one looks at the world as a whole, when one looks at the number of people who've been lifted out of absolute poverty around the world, China accounts for about 3/4 of them. So this is an achievement on an historic scale.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Griffiths. 那么下面有请香港岭南大学高级研究员刘淑勇先生发言。May I invite Mr. Liu Shuyong, Senior Research Fellow of Lingnan University, Hong Kong. Mr. Liu, please.
女士们、先生们，下午好。大家知道我是研究香港历史的，所以呢，今天我想从历史的角度来介绍一下这个中国共产党与香港的关系。其实，中国共产党与香港的关系，可能比许多朋友想象的时间更要早一些啊。大家知道，这个五四运动以后，就是许多宣传马克思主义的报刊杂志开始传入中国。当时呢，就有3位香港的年轻人，一位叫林昌志，一位叫张仁道，还有一位叫李义宝。这个林昌志呢，是当时香港政府的士学官，这个张义宝呢，是这个黄仁书院的毕业生，这个李义宝呢，他当时是一位小学教师。这3位当时在香港就办了一个刊物，叫做《真善美》，来宣传马克思主义的一些基本的原理。然后到了1920年的12月，当时陈独秀从北京到广州去，他路过香港。当时这3位年轻人听到以后，就带着他们的杂志，就到轮船上去会见陈独秀。陈独秀看他们这个刊物以后，对他们大加鼓励，希望他们成立一个马克思主义的研究小组。说回来以后，他们就在跑马地，建立一个马克思主义的小组。再以后，到了1923年的时候，他们也在香港建立了共产主义的一个青年团的一个支部。稍后又建立了中共的党小组。到了1925年初，香港已经有了中共的党支部。党支部的书记叫黄平，就是今天我们在座的其中一位社科院的专家黄平教授给他同名的。不过那位黄平是差不多100年前的历史人物了。 这是很早期的情况。然后大家知道这个工人阶级啊，是中国共产党这个工人阶级特别产业工人是中国共产党的建立的一个社会基础。香港的海员就是近代中国最早的产业工人之一，所以当时这个中共早期的党员也非常注意在海员中开展工作，所以像林昌志他们就经常到海员中间去演讲，宣传革命的道理。但是在这个中国的工人运动史上，大家知道曾经发生这个几次大的工人运动啊。一次呢，就是1922年的香港海员大罢工，还有1925年到1926年的省港大罢工，啊，这些工人运动，特别是香港的这个海员工会，就为中国共产党培养一批骨干。其中比较有名的，大家知道，就有林伟民、苏兆征，还有陈玉和曾生。这个林伟民和这个苏兆征是早期中国工人运动中间杰出的领袖人物。这个陈玉呢，在中华人民共和国建立以后，他曾经当过这个煤炭工业部的部长、燃料工业部的部长、广东省委书记。另外一位曾生，他曾经在抗战时期是华南最大的中共领导的抗日游击队东江纵队的司令员。49年以后，他曾经当过交通部的部长。这是这个中共与早期香港的工人运动的关系。大家知道，在1927年的时候，蒋介石发动所谓清党运动，一开始在上海，后来在广州，在广州发生那个所谓清党运动，叫4.15政变，当时逮捕了许多共产党人，一些著名的共产党人，你比如萧处女等，被他们处决。所以当时中共的广东省广东区委就在广东没办法活动了，他们就转移到了香港。就在内地叫做土地革命这一段时期，这个中共广东省委这个机关，它的名称变了很多次，但是它就是一直是在香港活动，把香港作为一个指挥广东甚至这个华南地区这个革命运动的一个指挥中心。这段时间呢，其实还有一个比较重要的事情，就是大概在1930年的秋，就是这个当时南方局中共的南方局和广东省委的支持下，中共中央开辟了一条从上海到中央苏区的这个秘密交通线。大家知道，当时因为国民党进行封锁，当时中共的这个很多负责的领导的人物都在上海，他们要直接去这个中央苏区非常困难，所以说辗转的通过香港然后到汕头然后再转过去到什么永定这一线最后进入中央苏区。前前后后大概有200多位中共的党和红军的重要的领导人物你比如说周恩来刘少奇还有邓小平以及这个叶剑英陈云、博古、任弼时等，都是通过这条交通线由上海最后转移到了中央苏区。这条交通线一直用到中央红军长征开始所以这是和香港有关系的一件事。 到了这个1937年全面抗战爆发以后，当时这个中国共产党得到英方的同意啊，派了廖承志在香港开办了八路军驻港办事处。他除了自己开展工作，同时还参加宋庆龄当时领导的保卫中国同盟的工作，啊，一方面呢，就是接收了大量这个国际友人和海外侨胞捐赠的物资，同时呢，他们还廖承志他们还印刷了一个刊物叫《华侨通讯》，介绍中国抗战的情况。同时，他们还帮助很多华侨青年回国参加八路军、新四军，还动员一些华侨组织司机和医务人员回国参加抗战等等，做了很多事情啊。大家知道这个抗战期间啊，中国共产党实际上是香港抗战的中流砥柱啊。1941年12月，日军进攻香港啊，当时英军呢抵抗了18天就投降了。在整个香港沦陷的3年08个月的期间啊，当时共产党领导的抗日游击队港九大队是香港曾建制的由始至终坚持抗战的唯一的一支武装力量啊。当时这个港九大队的前身和港九大队曾经参加过营救抗日文化人的秘密大营救，而港九大队呢，它以游击战的方式打击和牵制日军同时营救盟军的飞行员，同时帮助盟军收集到许多有关日军的军事情报等等整个这个抗战期间呢，港九大队有115位烈士为保卫香港而牺牲。到了战后，大家知道，因为这个抗战期间，这个中共与英国有比较好的这个合作的关系，所以抗战胜利后不久呢，当时英国人认为中共还没有掌权，对他们不构成威胁所以呢，他们允许共产党在香港某种程度的合法的存在。大家知道现在有中联办，其实大家知道中联办的前身是哪里呢？最早就是战后初期的东江纵队驻港办事处。这个办事处后来也改成了新华社香港分社。就战后初期就有一段时间，这个共产党就有了一个公开的常驻的这个工作机构就由于当时这种特殊的情况，所以当时的中共中央就决定以香港为中心开展城市工作所以当时这个香港呢，实际上在中共看来呢，是有它多重的作用一方面呢，就香港是当时进行反内战、反独裁的一个文化宣传的一个中心同时呢，它也是当时一些民主党派在这儿重新组织东山再起的一个地方它也是呢当时共产党领导的解放区的一个后勤资源的中心特别是到了后来这个内战打起来以后就是在内战的后期就是中国共产党在这里就是动员当时的民主党派开展新政协运动 响应中国共产党提出的五一口号后来中国共产党把当时在香港的许多民主党派的这些人士，就是分批的、秘密的运到了东北的解放区，参与这个筹备建立新中国的工作。所以这个香港对中华人民共和国的建立也有它特别的作用这是这个在中华人民共和国成立之前，大家知道1949年10月1号中华人民共和国就建立了中华人民共和国建立以后呢对香港是什么政策呢？当然大家知道，就是说中国共产党这个领导的中国政府认为呢，这个香港是中国的领土有关香港的3个条约都是不平等条约怎么解决呢？就是说准备在条件成熟的时候通过谈判解决在这个没有解决之前暂时维持现状。就建国初期，当时就说毛泽东主席、周恩来总理的决策是暂时先不收回香港希望利用香港的特殊的位置对国家的建设发挥作用所以当时提出的政策是叫做长期打算充分利用这么一个口号。具体的做法呢，就是说从政治上维护香港的稳定，从经济上支持香港的发展。具体怎么做的呢？你比如说1949年10月解放军大军南下但是大家注意知道，这个解放军大军南下没有一直打到深圳河。为什么呢？因为当时就说毛泽东主席、周恩来总理当时有一条命令，就说解放军的野战军到了罗湖口岸以北40公里的樟木头一线就停下来了，不能越过樟木头一线。什么原因呢？就是避免引起香港社会恐慌。那个边界线怎么办呢？边界线派那个地方部队来维持治安，这是在政治方面的做法。在经济方面，大家都非常知道的，就是说，比如说很著名的这个事例，就是东江水供港和3趟快车，这些呢就体现了这个经济上，中国共产党领的中国政府对香港的支持，当然呢也是香港与内地互惠互利的体现。大家知道，香港这个水资源非常缺乏，二战以后人口急剧增长，工业也发展得很快，这个矛盾就更加突出。大家都想一下，当时香港是那个自来水是进不到家里的，是在街上安很多水喉，叫做来供水的。1963年的时候，香港遇到60年没有的大旱，水非常缺乏，所以当时的香港政府采取治水政策。这个政策是怎么规定呢？就是说4天供1次水，1次水只供4个小时，到了这么严重的程度，严重的影响了老百姓的生活和这个工业的发展。因为当时香港发展都是搞那个纺织业制衣业这些东西，当时比如漂染的话，那是需要大量用水的所以当时非常困难。所以当时一些爱国的团体，比如中华总商会、工联会，还有英国政府，也都向中国政府提出希望用东江水来解决这个困难。所以后来当时的周恩来总理就拍板要修东江深圳供水工程，长远解决香港用水的困难。大家不要忘了，1960年代 是当时中国遭受自然灾害，经济还没有完全恢复的一个情况下，在这个情况下，国家拿了3800万元人民币，这个数字现在看的并不大，在当时还是天文数字，用来兴建这个东江深圳供水的1期工程，而且周恩来总理只要求收回工程成本就可以了，不要求再有更多的什么经济上的收益。当时1吨救命的水，大家想一想，才收多少钱？收人民币1角钱，收这么一点点钱，这是在这个供水方面。所以后来这个供水大部分呢都是靠这个内地你比如说这个以1997年为例吧，内地输往香港的水量是7.5亿立方米，占了当年香港耗水量9.13亿立方米的82%。另外呢，就是为了解决这个供港鲜活商品运输的困难，从1962年开始，铁道部和外经贸部当时安排了751次、753次、755次等，这叫做大家通俗的叫做3趟快车，就是专门来运送这个一些冷冻商品到香港来，1年365天，只休息1天，这个内地这个我们供应香港的这个食品或者工业原料这个价格一般低于西方工业发达国家，所以内地这个食品和原料的稳定的供应，再加上这个当时香港政府还有公共房屋政策等等合到一起，这也使得香港的通货膨胀率和这个劳动力成本大大的低于西方工业发达国家，这就提高了港产品在国际市场的这个竞争力。最后我想讲一下，就是说总结一下早年中国共产党与香港的关系，其实大致可以分为2个阶段。1949年10月1日，中华人民共和国成立之前，中共呢是利用香港独特的地位，保存、发展和壮大自己，为反抗外来侵略和建立新中国开展工作。1949年10月1日，中华人民共和国成立之后呢，中共呢是利用香港独特的地位，为国家的经济建设服务。同时，因为49年之后，共产党成为执政党，所以呢，他对香港的影响力呢就大为增加了。它成为香港经济起飞、繁荣稳定一个极其重要的因素。今天我就讲这里，谢谢大家。
好的，非常感谢刘树勇教授的讲话我们最后呢，有请德国奥森纳布吕克应用科学大学公法教授莱汉瑞先生视频发言。Please invite Mr. Hendrik Lechner, Professor of Public Law from Osnabrück University of Applied Science, Germany.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure and privilege to attend this important international symposium on the Communist Party of China's history of 100 years. Thank you very much indeed to the organizers from the Bohemia magazine for the invitation. From 1921 to 2021, it is hard to put into words what has happened in these 100 years in the world and especially in China. The pace of development in China is so dynamic, so rapid, that one is amazed and speechless over and over again. The resurgence of China as a leading global economic power, an innovation driver and future shaper is likely to be unique in human history. And therein lies the first central argument for the title of my presentation, which I formulated as a thesis. Why China is important, why we should know more about China, and what we can learn from China. We will only be able to understand tomorrow's world if we understand China. Anyone who wants to understand China has to deal openly and impartially with this large and proud country, its eventful history, its unique culture, and certainly also with the Chinese language. Anyone who wants to understand China must also deal with the political system in China and the Chinese constitution. And this includes, of course, dealing with the Communist Party as the central actor in the Chinese constitutional system. The Communist Party and its leading role in the Chinese constitutional system, that would certainly be a challenging question that could be dealt with in Germany from a comparative law perspective. Before I come to the question of what we can learn from China, I would like to outline 3 premises. First, an open and impartial engagement with China is not to be found that often, actually. Many have already formed wrong. Nobody likes to be reprimanded. That especially China is sensitive in this respect seems more than understandable, not least because China has experienced a century of humiliation by foreign powers, from the Opium Wars to the occupation of parts of China by Japan during World War II. As Germans, we are well advised to deal self-critically with our own history and our own historical misconduct. Moral rigorism is usually not a good advisor. This applies in particular to international relations. Former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder made a very clear statement in this respect just recently. Former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt had already urged renunciation of Western arrogance and respect for the oldest cultural nation in the world in his book, One Last Visit, Encounters with the World Power China in 2013. Third, scientists have the task of generating new knowledge, driving innovations forward, and contributing to solving major societal challenges by asking critical questions and questioning things. But that does not mean that criticism should be an end in itself. Imagine a married couple celebrating its golden wedding anniversary. What do you think should be in the focus of their golden wedding celebration? Certainly, the positive moments and events, shared memories, and common achievements. Of course, we all know from personal experience that a long marriage is not all about good days. Nevertheless, it is a question of respect for the great achievements of the Chinese people that in an anniversary year, which is so important for China, one not only refers to problems, differences, and disagreements, but also honestly acknowledges the unimaginable historical success achieved in the process of modernizing China during the past decades. A few weeks ago, I published the book China Competence in Germany and Germany Competence in China at Springer Nature, together with my colleagues Hu Chunchun and Thomas Zimmer from Tongji Daxue. In her foreword, the former Minister of Education, Annette Schaban, emphasizes the importance of a trust-based diplomacy. When we welcome delegations from China at our university, we regularly experience that our Chinese guests speak excellent German, have excellent knowledge about Germany and its history, and also and are also experts on German discourses and developments in the respective discipline. In Germany, on the other hand, we know far too little about China, its history, its modernization, and current developments. The development of China competence at German schools and universities is therefore an extremely important topic. China has been Germany's most important trading partner for a couple of years now. Many German companies have had close economic relationships with China for decades. Conversely, Chinese-run companies in Germany employ a large number of German employees. Against this background, it is long overdue that we in Germany deal more intensively with China, just as we dealt with America after World War II. In his congratulatory letter of October 1st, 2019, on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, the German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier emphasized the intensive partnership and interdependence between Germany and China. A year earlier, in a speech to students in Sichuan, President Steinmeier expressed the wish that many more people in Germany deal more intensively with China, with its history, culture, and language. By doing so, we could learn a lot, actually. Let me just mention 4 examples. First, we could learn from China to see in new developments, especially in new technology, not only the threat, but above all, the opportunities. When we look at megacities like Beijing, Shanghai, or Shenzhen, we look to the cities of the future. China, for example, has succeeded in quickly getting the corona pandemic under control with modern technology, artificial intelligence, and big data. For example, through intelligent contact tracing. Second, former President Christian Wulff praised the Chinese enthusiasm for education in his inaugural speech in 2010. I personally experienced the hard work, the enormous discipline, and the real joy of learning in exchange with the students from Hefei Xuyuan and from Zhongguo Zhengfa Daxue, where I have the pleasure to teach as a visiting professor. Third, the Swiss sinologist Havo von Senger dealt with the Chinese art of long-term strategic planning in his book Supraplanung, Unrecognized Horizons of Thought from the Middle Kingdom. This would certainly be a beneficial broadening of perspectives for us in Germany too, especially when dealing with contradictions. And last but not least, the Chinese way of life, which is simply amazing and inspiring. In terms of international understanding, more direct contacts between Germans and Chinese would therefore be absolutely desirable. The peoples-to-peoples dialogue and the concept of change by exchange, the slogan of the German Academic Exchange Service, DAAD, would benefit remarkably. I wish you a successful conference and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lechner. Now it comes to the end of today's event. I suggest we give a round of applause to our guests for their impressive insights. And thank you everyone to the International Symposium on the Communist Party of China's history of 100 years. At the end, let's say happy birthday to the Communist Party of China on your 100 years birthday, and we look for a better future. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.